Welcome, everybody. Sorry about the confusion. We had another meeting that somebody scheduled using the same account, which knocked us off. But we are back and ready to talk about again. So we were talking about um, the the large numbers of Jews who were in the um, the industry. It was a belief that up to 40% of all Jews in Poland at one point worked in the industry. And remember, Poland was by far the largest population of Jews. So a very high percent of all Jews were in that business in the world in the 20th century and 19th century early on. Because now, when you talk about the alcohol business, for those of you in business, and I am not, obviously, if you want to make money, kind of like the movie studios, you try and own everything. You own the distribution, you buy the actual cinemas. And so Jews were very heavily involved in the producing of alcohol, but it's believed at one point 85% of all taverns in Poland were owned or operated by Jews. 85%. So if you're going from one place to another and you stop at an inn, you are stopping and you know there's going to be Jews there. It just became the way of things that people knew when they went to inns or when they were drinking that it was a Jewish industry and it was just known. And I was reading, why does this seem so strange? Why is it not part of our history? Because Jews erased it. Like in the 20th century, and Jews realized it gave us a bad stereotype, so they started erasing the history, not talking about it, keeping it, rubbing it under pushing it under the rug. And so today, most Jews, including me and a lot of people, didn't realize the extent of how many Jews were in this business. Now, Eastern Europe is obviously where the highest percentage, but you go to France, you go to Germany, you go all over Europe, you go to the Ottoman Empire, where they're doing alcohol for non-Muslims. The Jews were doing that. Did somebody mention the Tokaj wine? What was the wine you mentioned? And along with that, Hungary, Austria, it just goes on and on. There are very famous European Jewish people who made a lot of money. The Herzog, of course, is still very famous together. The Herzog family, they produced the alcohol for none other than kings. I mean, they were producing it for Emperor Franz Joseph, and he made them his exclusive wine distributor for the emperor himself. Jews were right there when they started industrializing breweries. So whiskey really became very popular in Eastern Europe, but other places. Now, when you look at some of these places, it was big business through the 19th, 20th century, and really up until the early 20th century in many places where a lot of countries, kept them out. But if you've heard of Kabach, Kretschmer, Schenkman, Korczak, Vigoda, Winnick, or Brofman, those are Jewish names connected with the alcohol business. Like the name itself is intertwined with alcohol. So it's a huge, huge money maker for Jews. Obviously, you have famous ones like Herzog and Fleischmann's, but owning taverns, making your own beer and selling it. This has been a popular thing in the Jewish world for a long time. And I would, it's not I'm not a big alcohol drinker, so, but it's really interesting that it's so prevalent. Now, when we come to America, and North America, I had that for obvious reasons we'll talk about in a second, then we realized that these things continued. Jim Beam, I.W. Harper, Rittenhouse, Elijah Craig, Four Roses, Dickel are just some of the names of bourbons and that are Jewish. So our history in this area goes back probably all the way back to the 1400s when Jews were first, they were really starting to restrict Jews even earlier. And so they went into an area like this and it really helped a lot of them. So who are some famous ones in the US? So when did Jews become famous distillers? Obviously, Prohibition helped if you were connected to the mafia. But even more than that, what got Jews in the field was after Prohibition. Because after Prohibition, the distilleries, all the factories had been dormant for a good amount of years and they were no longer working. And in order to restart the industry, you needed capital and you needed know-how. And this is where a lot of Jews put their money into restarting it or getting investors to help them. And so this is where a lot of them went into the business big time, not just in America, but obviously Canada is probably even more famous for that because of Seagram's. But let's go through a few that I read about that were especially, you may have heard of them, I haven't heard of all of them. Isaac Wolf Bernheim. German guy comes here, failed as a peddler, went to the Midwest, goes into the bourbon business in a place called Louisville and helps to start bourbon. His brother Bernard came and the Berman brothers introduced I.W. Harper, which became the country's biggest brand of bourbon. And they owned a 13,000 acre natural preserve in Kentucky, or ones that's named after them. And very nearby, Heaven Hill, Evan Williams, Elijah Craig Bourbon, Rittenhouse Rye, Pikesville, all the Shapira family also, who came over from Lithuania, and his horse broke down and he decides to go in this business with 5 of his sons. After everything's closed, when Prohibition is repealed, the Shapiras start in the business again. They invest $15,000. They hire somebody named Harry Beam and his cousin Earl to help. And then, of course, the rest is history. And so it's one after the other, very similar. You don't have money, you go into it, and all of a sudden you own Jim Beam, which I wish I would have invested in. And they got a lot of money from Chicago, by the way, for that. I don't know if it was legal or illegal money, but and the investors were Jewish as well. Jewish Philip Blum is a guy who bought out the company when they were trying to sell it to another Jew and really made it even bigger. But the most famous right now are the whiskey, of course, Sam Rothman. I don't know if anybody's heard of him. Seagram's, very famous billionaire who's he's very philanthropic. But Seagram's became one of the biggest companies in the world, and Sam Rothman founded it. And in Canada, he was one of the people who was bootlegging alcohol into the U.S. during Prohibition and turned this company into a huge company. And then when his son took it over, he eventually sold it and then really went into philanthropy afterwards. So they would merge with Seagram's and then, of course, sell it in, I think, 2000. And so if you've ever seen Seagram's, which is a huge brand, that's a Jewish, Grey Goose Vodka, that was a Jewish person who founded that. So what we see is that the rules of alcohol are very similar. Is it's all about opportunity. And all of these individuals, most of whom I had heard of, came over and they started out as peddlers, whether they were the German immigration or the Russian or the Eastern European immigration. Didn't work out. They found a niche in this area, whether it was before Prohibition, during, or after. And they used their knowledge, their resources, their money, their connections to grow their brand. And obviously, they probably employed lots of Jews. There's lots of smaller ones that didn't become so famous. So even though it's not the percentage that we had in Eastern Europe in the 19th century or 17th century, Jews have been very, very, very prominent in this area. Any thoughts or questions? I think I put everybody to sleep with that.
I wanted to just mention one or two things. I think a lot of people have been to the Prohibition Museum in Savannah, which it's not necessarily Jewish, but it shows the influence of having a port. Atlantic City had a big port where they were able to bring stuff in illegally, and Savannah had this big port. If you haven't been there, it's
great.
A good museum, very, very good. I would highly recommend it. And the other anecdotal kind of thing is, I recall back whenever we were young and we went to weddings, let's say of a relative, they would always have a bottle of scotch and a bottle of rye whiskey, and they would be the small bottles on the table. In those days, the caterer didn't have liquor licenses, I guess, or things like this. So I don't know if it was widespread throughout the United States, but certainly in the New York area, that was the way the caterers kind of operated. It was almost like a bring your own bottle. And the third thing I wanted to mention, and everybody of course knows that the center of Judaism is in New Jersey, and we had the only winery, I think, in the United States that was producing wine during the Prohibition era in New Jersey here, because they were producing it for churches and for synagogues and things of that nature. So they got an exemption. Whether they produced other things, I don't know, but there may be one or two others in the country, but I know New Jersey was famous for that.
Yeah, and again, it's it's just a part of our history, and again, it's a good part, but it's also an issue. I mean, the first winery in Jerusalem and an age, because it was of course taken over by the Muslim world, was a Jewish one that was started in the Old City in 1848. So it's great that you see us doing these really, but then also there was a negative part to it, and that's what we'll talk about to conclude. And what's the negative part? It's if you know that you become too connected or linked to a certain field, you're going to be attached to the negative connotations. And liquor was big business, and people in Poland and Ukraine knew that Jews were in this business, so there became that. And this is one of the things that got Jews kicked out of the business in the late 1800s, was this belief that Jews were, and they didn't own the whole business. Obviously, some of it was Polish nobility that was funding them, but that these sober Jews, or Jews who didn't drink, because that was a stereotype, were enticing people to drink more and more and more and get them all become all drunkards to make money for us. And that the reason there was so much alcohol abuse in the Christian world was because of the Jews. And you can read the Bible where it talks about, prohibitions and things that go wrong with alcohol. And so, although it was a very profitable business, there were probably side effects, and that eventually is what got Jews out of the business. Although there were some Jews still in the business in Western Europe and Germany, all the way up to the World War II. But in Eastern Europe, they were kind of kicked out of that world. And if you go to the Prohibition Museum, they do mention the synagogue as, I tell the rabbis were the most popular people in America in the 1920s because we had access to legal alcohol. So I bet there were a lot more people coming to services during Prohibition than before or after. Although I don't know if people really wanted to come for just Manischewitz, but it was certainly part of the charm. So, and it's one of the things we have difficulty with. Again, it's the support for the industry, the understanding of the weakness of the human body and mind, and the balance that needs to be met. And that is something that is going to be with us. Alan. And Alan, you're still on mute, by the way.
2 days ago, I'm reading the Saturday Evening Post, which the mature among us recognize. Okay. And they got a little, they call it the grid, and there's these little things here about wine. Okay. And I'll read you 5 quick ones. In ancient Greece, the host always sipped the wine first to prove it wasn't poisoned. The oldest known extant bottle of wine, made as early as 325 AD, was excavated from a Roman soldier's tomb in 1867. And the ancient Egyptian ruler Scorpion I was entombed with 700 full jars of wine. And wine in ancient Rome was often made in lead pots because it sweetened the wine. But it also poisoned drinkers. And modern class action, wine drinking wasn't banned from French high schools until 1981. And notably, a high school classmate of mine, has a winery in Napa Valley. And we just missed each other on our hometown visits this year.
It's a beautiful area. It is a beautiful area if you've ever had a chance to go there. And again, as we know, in today's world, Jews are mostly known for alcohol because of the Israeli wine industry, which is so big right now. Now, they've done wine, obviously, since biblical times, and they exported it during the Roman period, most famously. But most recently, they've had a lot, upswing in kosher wine business. And I wish Bubba was here to tell us exactly some of the numbers. Has been incredible in the last 30 or 40 years. It seems like it's kind of like what happened in Napa, I guess, in the 70s, 80s is happening in Israel the last 20 years. It's just these wineries are popping up and they're becoming so popular. Almost any tour you go to Israel, they take you to a winery. If you go to any shelves, you're going to see Israeli wine. It's just, I guess they've become known for. So, and they have an incredible amount of acreage in Israel dedicated to vineyards, which is pretty interesting because there's just not that much acreage in Israel, especially in the north and the Galilee where all the vineyards are. That's not a very big place. So they have a lot of vineyards there, and they've really become very, very famous. So again, I'm sure Bubba could just go list all of the different numbers, but they export a lot of wine out of Israel, especially to America and Europe, even though Europe is not always on good terms with Israel. But that's a big business in Israel. Anybody been on a wine tour in Israel before? I don't even like wine, but I enjoy it. So whenever I lead a trip, we always try and include that in it.
What are notable brand names of wine from Israel?
Anybody have any favorites? There's King David, Tishbe. What are some other ones? Let me look on. I don't know all of them because I am not a wine drinker. Let's see here. I'm gonna type that in, see if I can figure it out. Top 10 Israeli wines from Haaretz. Here they are. Golan Heights Syrah, Pelter Pinot Noir, Chevaux Rosé, Marguerite, Enigma, Domaine, Du Castel, Grand Vin, Clos de Gatchan, I don't know, Sora, Seahorse, Bravdo, Yatir. So those are some of the big ones.
They have the prices of a bottle on that site.
Let's see here.
Mutt?
Yes, gold $55. Colin Heights $161 for the Pelter, $26 for the Chevaux. Marguerite $75. They also say if they're kosher or not. Domain $75. Kloss $24. Tsora $60. Seahorse $19. Bravdo $32. Yatir $20. That's a dollar.
When did the Kiddush come in play of the blessing, enchanting the entire Kiddush before meals?
When did the prayer come in, or when did the Kiddush?
Well, actually, using the wine, I guess, as the Kiddush cup and that whole idea of thanking God for the fruit of the vine, not Passover, but
Right.
in the weekly service.
Well, I mean, there's two questions there, because one is, when did wine become part of ritual? And that is very early on, because they're using wine during the temple period during the sacrifices. The priests were not allowed to use wine, but wine was already being used for various traditions then. The blessing for the wine that we use today is from the Talmud. So it's somewhere between 200 to 500 in there. Probably 1st or 2nd century, 3rd century. Again, wine with meals has already become popular, but the Kiddush, as we know it, is probably about 2,000 years old. That's, when it was created, maybe 1,900 years. The idea of linking the Sabbath with the wine. Now, doing it in the sanctuary, which is what we do, is probably only been around about 1,000 years, and really became super popular with the Reform movement probably in the last 150 years. Because traditionally, you say the cup of wine before you wash and do challah, and then you eat your meal. So you go to services and then go home and do wine and challah. Whereas in the mid ages, but really in the modern world, we've been doing it in the sanctuary. So we do it, in the conservative, even the Orthodox will do it as well in their congregation. So that's fairly new.
And the l'chaim, did that come about? Was that an Eastern European kind of thing?
That I don't know. That's a good question. When did l'chaim come into it? Anybody know? I can look that up. That I don't know. That's a good question. Let me see here. Let's see, his origins. I don't see anything that leads me to say. I don't know when. We'll have to look that up. I don't know. I'll take longer to look that one up. That wasn't so easy. So that's a good question. When did we start saying l'chaim? I think it probably became super popular after Fiddler on the Roof.
Well, that's
Sure. I have a feeling in the more liberal world, that's when it happened. So many of our traditions, the priestly benedictions become so popular. We use, of course, a lot of that music for weddings. The lifting up in the chairs with the napkin. I think that was probably traditions, but we kind of entered our world in 1970. So interesting stuff. Any other thoughts on this? So remember, Alan.
Yeah, I posted a couple of links where in the chat to go to some history and some
great, thank you.
Wine thing, okay, and notably in 600, we were producing wine in Israel before the 600 BC, and then in 600 BC, Arabs conquered Israel, and wine production stopped because Muslim laws prevented alcohol in their world. Okay, so And there would be another 1,200 years before wine would again be produced in Israel, in the region.
Yeah, the Muslims let them do it in the mid 19th century, not to serve to Muslims, but for the Jews, for ritual
Right.
purposes, and for the Christians.
Tripped
So-
over that little fact too. Okay.
No, I mean that's what happened. I mean, again,
Yeah.
the Ottoman Empire gave them permission, but it was a very limited.
You had mentioned alcoholism and Judaism were kind of like at opposite ends, but yet, there is some alcoholism. And from your work, which I understand, mostly the Savannah area, is it a larger percentage? I mean, has it been increasing, alcoholism? And
No, I don't think it's been. Now,
Prevention
when it comes to percentages, I think we're pretty much in line with people and, Christians in our same, economic level, same education level. I think we're probably similar. Has it been increasing? I don't know if it's been, COVID probably increased it a little bit, but I think it's been a problem for a long time. It's just we didn't talk about it. It's one of those things that was, put to the side or ignored, or you sent somebody away for a year. And that's how we looked at it. Whereas today we know it's really a disease and it's biological as well. So there's a lot of Jewish centers now that work with it, a lot of Jewish organizations. We were supposed to have a speaker in a couple weeks, but he's not going to come till October because he had to change the date. So we'll have a speaker who's going to talk about it, but it's very prevalent in the Jewish world like everywhere else. We deal with it all the time. I mean, I deal with it all the time, unfortunately. And it's a very difficult thing because it can destroy somebody's life and then destroy the families, because if your children get addicted, it's total guilt. You don't know what to do. It can be a drain on resources, on emotions. You could spend all your time dealing with this child and, the other child feels ignored. There's pressures from the community, from the outside world. So it can be a real problem. And I'm sure everybody here knows a lot of people who have this issue or have family members with this issue.
I've heard of the Alcohol Anonymous, of course, the AA, and they seem to be doing some wonderful work. But they're a religious-based organization. At least they started out, didn't they, as a Christian
They
organization?
still are, but you can do it Jewishly as well. It's a little harder in an area our size, but they have the Jewish AA version as well.
There is a Jewish AA. I didn't realize.
For a long time, alcohol in very moderate forms, and certainly a glass of red wine every day, was considered to be something that's good for your health. And
I think it still is.
For cardiac health, no, it's not. Apparently, over the last 5 years, there have been a whole bunch of studies that conclude that the positive effects of alcohol are far outweighed by the negative effects. My primary care has stopped drinking because of all these studies. So I'm looking for a new doctor who would give different advice. But
I'm sure I can find you a lot. I can find you a lot.
But seriously, that's I wonder what, because it is alcoholism is somewhat socioeconomically based. I wonder if that's going to, to change over the years, if people are going to listen to physicians.
Well, it's a balance like anything else. Do you prohibit it? And probably the majority who do not have these issues and ban it from them. And we saw what happened in Prohibition. It gave rise to an entire underground of issues and created havoc in our country for a long time. But it's a balance. It's making sure, teach and watch your children and making sure they understand. And also, most importantly, from my perspective, drinking and driving, which we know everybody agrees with, is a blight on society. So that is just, an obvious.
Cirrhosis of the liver and all of those kinds of things, I think, definitely. There are some medical problems.
There are some medicals too.
Yeah. It is interesting that you see in the cigarette industry that, they have all these warnings and things like this. I'm not sure that alcohol has those. When you buy a bottle of whiskey or whatever it is. It's not, there's no labels on it, that try to frighten you off or at least alert you to the fact that, these are hazardous to your health or things of that nature.
Yeah, I think what happened with the cigarette industry is obviously they did some really nefarious things and lying and intentionally making it more addictive, and then lying about it, and then all these things to cover up. And that's one of the reasons that it fell apart. Cigarettes, I believe cigarettes do more damage overall because, there's no, one way or the other. It's one cigarette is bad for you, period.
Yeah, secondhand smoke also.
Yeah, and affects other people. But alcohol has the same problems, and maybe
Drunk driving.
Drunk driving, I mean, there's certain things everybody agrees with. So drunk driving is wrong, and that is a punishable offense. And everybody knows that cigarettes are not healthy for you. I mean, it's not a question anymore. Although it was a question for years, before they had all those issues. But yeah, it's a balance, as Judaism has said very appropriately. It's a balance between one and the other, enjoying it and abusing it. Most people can do one without the other. Some people can do one without the other, but they then do the other. Some people who can control themselves end up abusing it. And then there are people who biologically or whatever reason cannot. And they're naturally addicted. And I think we all have our addictions. Some of us are addicted to sugar. Some of us are addicted to TV. Some of us are addicted to things that are much worse, drugs. Some of us addicted to, it's what the body, so you have to read your body. And if you can't handle it, then find a way not to. It's just one of those difficult debates. So, and I've been on a year-long seminar talking about these issues. So we were supposed to have a speaker. So we'll be having a speaker in October. But always a pleasure. But again, we'll be here next week. We're going to do Jews on Broadway. So if you have any information on that, it'll be a little bit about actors and stuff, but really a lot about the writers and the musicians and the backers. So, and of course, the most famous story, I don't think it has anything with Jews, with my most favorite story about Broadway is the Boston Red Sox owner who wanted to, he needed money for a play, and so he sold a guy named Babe Ruth to the New York Yankees.
What does that have to do with Broadway?
They didn't win a World Series for 90 years. What?
Well, I didn't get the connection with Broadway.
The guy who was the owner of the Red Sox wanted to produce a Broadway show.
Oh, he wanted to produce a Broadway.
He needed money, and so he
I
sold
see.
Babe Ruth to the New York Yankees. That's why he sold. He sold a bunch of other players to New York Yankees. A bunch of their best players came from Boston, who were the better team. And as of 1918, and he sold off all these great players, and all of a sudden New York is the better team for a century. So
yeah, there was
It's
just
a great baseball season, by the way.
well, huh?
Yeah.
Is
I
it
think it's a great baseball season, by the way.
right now? Good.
Yeah.
PBS has a nice documentary going on right now that you might be able to catch also about the revival of Broadway, when Broadway became kind of seedy in the late 1960s, and then how it revived, and Disney.
Oh, really? That may be interesting.
Yeah, I've done some talks on that for Ollie. As a matter of fact, I'm doing a talk this semester for Ollie on Candor and Ebb.
Oh, wow.
And the other guys that wrote Chicago and Cabaret,
That's
and
great.
things of that nature, and not as
Everybody
famous,
go to that.
not as famous as Rodgers and Hammerstein, but boy, did they had a career that lasted 40 years together. So I mean, and just some unbelievable musicals that they wrote. I think 11 or 12 musicals in that 40 years, and not all Chicago and Cabaret, but really some wonderful
Nice.
stuff with great themes in it. Both Jewish guys, one from Missouri and one from Westchester or someplace. They met in New York City. So I could talk a little bit about them. And
Please bring, that'd be great.
Yeah.
And it was similar in the distillery. Apparently, alcohol lost a lot of popularity in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and the spirits version. And so But that's made a big comeback as well. So, all right, guys, thank you so much. Always a pleasure. We got so much stuff coming up. No, for this Sunday, we will have Paul Lips, who is a professor in Israel. He'll be speaking during our lunch. We'll have that on YouTube, and we'll have it on Zoom if you want to participate.
Did you say Sunday or Saturday?
Saturday at 12:30.
Saturday, 12:30. Oh,
Okay,
okay.
I'll have Jennifer send out the link.
Yeah, we're hoping to be back in South Carolina this weekend.
Oh,
so
great.
there's-
Welcome back. Look forward to
Yeah,
seeing you
yeah,
guys.
we're hoping to drive back tomorrow, and so there's a good chance we might get our internet hooked up.
All right,
Drive
good luck.
safely.
Drive safely,
Okay,
guys.
take care. Bye, everybody.
Be safe, everybody. See
Bye.
you next